empathy.
Any empathy?
If you watched the DNC, you probably heard this word quite a bit.
His empathy.
Biden's empathy.
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 Today, I'd like to propose a bit of a different take on empathy. I think he is a master at empathy, among other things, but it isn't so much that we identify with him. He identifies with us. That's a Trump supporter, commenting on a post I made on r/AskTrumpSupporters, asking if they felt empathy for Trump. I accompanied the post with a passage from The Dark Sides of Empathy by Fritz Breithaupt. The Trump supporters who commented had various issues with the wording of the passage, namely Breithaupt's usage of the term victim. Victimhood is for leftists and Democrats. I'll just read one of the posts, a little abridged. You can tell that this was written by an academic. They have a knack for swapping out reality for abstraction any chance they get, and pretending that the latter is the former. So, in this sample, Trump was not subjected to an obtrusive, illegitimate, and fruitless investigation, Russia. It lasted for 3.5 years in reality. He just presents himself that way. So, since Trump only presents himself as a victim for the purposes of gaining empathy, he shouldn't really be angry, he shouldn't really feel unfairly targeted. And none of us who have watched the person we elected get treated like a piñata should really be upset about it either. No apology, no acknowledgement, no reflection from the press, they just move on to the next kill. We are supporting the real-life man who wants what we want, and is fighting like hell to get it, against opponents who act and lie viciously. The author has his head in the clouds, imagining that we support Trump because we are wrapped up in some psychological narrative that he is spinning through media performance. Sorry, try again. Leave the university and try talking to some living Trump supporters. We are supporting what he is trying to do, in spite of all of his flaws. That's empathy for you. Yeah, that is empathy. What's my point here? Well, I hope if you're on the left, you're starting to think that empathy might not be a pure force for good. And if you're on the right, you're realizing that empathy isn't an exclusively left-wing idea. Welcome to Political Therapist, a show about the role of human emotions in shaping our political views. Today, is empathy bad for politics? That might seem like an absurd question to even ask, but give me some time. This begins with...
Okay, there's only one problem.
About a month ago, a Twitter user clipped Ben Shapiro talking about why empathy is bad.
Okay, empathy is actually kind of bad for politics.
The tweet blew up, and several people on the left responded to it.
Ben Shapiro is essentially pro-sociopath. That's what he's saying.
I'd like to be very clear here. Regardless of what you think about Ben Shapiro's positions and rhetoric, being against empathy is not the same as being pro-sociopath. Being against empathy means using mechanisms other than empathy to understand what's best for people.
The reason that empathy is bad for politics is because it leads you to empathize with people that you are more likely to like, as opposed to people you don't like.
Shapiro isn't the most articulate in this clip.
Okay, so first of all, the pitch for empathy is actually...
He trails off a little.
There have been several books that are written on this.
Several books. For this video, I read 2 of them.
Social science books, talking about how empathy is not actually the best thing for politics. It actually almost deactivates the reasoning centers of your brain.
He sounds like an idiot, but to be fair to Shapiro, his job is to talk for 3 hours every day. He's been using this talking point for years, and he mentioned it again when he talked about the DNC. He just happened to phrase it poorly this time.
Is actually...
And so he was lambasted.
He just let it all out, bro.
We'll get to that a little later. First, what is empathy? Google defines empathy as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Michelle Obama defines it as
the ability to walk in someone else's shoes.
I'd agree with both of those definitions. But as often happens with the popular conception of empathy, the definition starts to expand.
The recognition that someone else's experience has value too.
I apologize a little for being pedantic, but this is a completely different definition. She even goes on to argue that the truest form of empathy is helping others.
That is the truest form of empathy. Not just feeling, but doing.
I have to stick with her first definition, because otherwise the job of saying anything about empathy becomes impossible. Empathy is an emotional mechanism that can lead to helping others, but empathy itself is not helping others. Here we enter a bit of a definition game. If you disagree with my definition, try to accept that any quality that I attribute to empathy is to this specific definition of empathy, not whatever your conception of it is. To be more specific, I'd like to split that definition into two types of empathy. Most research distinguishes between cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand someone else's perspective. Affective empathy, or emotional empathy, is sharing someone else's emotions. Take this scene from Whiplash. You might be feeling some affective empathy watching the video now, at the sight of the pain Andrew is in. However, if you watch the whole movie, you'd feel both cognitive empathy and affective empathy because you'd understand his situation. Oftentimes, but not always, these two types of empathy go together. The other distinction I'd like to make is between dispositional empathy and situational empathy. Dispositional empathy is a measure of how empathetic a specific person is. Situational empathy is the action of using empathy. So you could be a very empathetic person generally, but you don't feel situational empathy for Trump watching his Axios interview, or watching Biden stumble over his words.
Go to Joe 30330.
Another crucial aspect of this definition is that there are ways other than empathy to care about people. This is where some criticism of Shapiro falls apart. Although when empathy finds a few different ways, the one you think of mathematical utilitarian sense. That feels pretty cold and cruel to me, so we better exercise compassion, which is a general love for all people. Different empathy, which is sharing the emotions of a specific person. Compassion doesn't require you to know anything about a person, just to emotionally understand that they matter. The final qualification, all types of empathy are good in social situations. That's what we build for, if exercised effectively. So, what's a time when empathy is bad? There's a 10-year-old girl named Sherry Summers. She has a terminal illness. Sherry is in line for treatment from the Quality of Life Foundation. The organization works to make the lives of young children better before they die, but Sherry is pretty far back on the waiting list. Should you move her up in line? From a coldly rational perspective, the answer is relatively obvious. She's far back on the waiting list because there are other children, in situations worse than hers, who need the treatment more. This isn't a real scenario. Rather, it was a situation created by researcher C. Daniel Batson. He asked one group of his participants to use empathy, while he asked the other to remain detached and objective. A third of the rational group moved her up in line. 3/4 of the empathy group did. This is what Paul Bloom calls the spotlight effect. If you use situational empathy, you focus on one person, possibly at the expense of the greater good. For a political example, watch any State of the Union address. When discussing illegal immigration, Trump highlights the victims of crimes by illegal immigrants.
51-year-old American named Rocky Jones. Rocky was at a gas station when this vile criminal fired 8 bullets at him from close range, murdering him in cold blood.
Then he highlights the families of these victims.
One of his grieving brothers is here with us tonight. Jody, would you please stand? Jody.
Trump places the family of this murder victim at the center of your empathetic spotlight. He uses it as evidence that illegal immigration leads to more crime. A claim that's questionable at best, given that illegal immigrants commit crime at lower rates than the general population. Democrats, on the other hand, point to the victims of Trump's immigration policy. None of this empathy, for either side really, says anything about what proper immigration policy looks like. If you transfer this to other issues, after police killings, Democrats tend to have empathy for the people killed, while Republicans tend to have empathy for the cops. This is the spotlight effect in action. We choose to have empathy for a certain group of people in a way that justifies our political beliefs. Thinking practically, the spotlight effect has broader implications. After all, who are you more likely to focus on? One study looked at soccer fans. Both in an MRI machine and according to their own reporting, they felt less empathy when fans of an opposing soccer team were feeling pain than when the fans of the same soccer team were. We're predisposed to have more empathy for members of an in-group. Another study tested based on race. White people feel significantly less affective empathy when watching a video of a sad black person. Don't get me wrong here, empathy isn't responsible for tribalism, but its expression is affected by tribalism. Another study looked at political parties, not just whether we have less situational empathy for those with different politics, but what the effects of higher dispositional empathy are. People higher in dispositional empathy are more likely to rate the opposing party more negatively. Think about that for a second. Not only is empathy biased toward the in-group, but people who have more empathy hate the out-group more. And here's another situation proposed by the same study. A speaker is going to a college campus and protests erupt from people who disagree with them. The researchers asked a few questions about whether the speech should have happened. People with higher dispositional empathy, if they're from the opposing party of the speaker, are more likely to want to censor the speaker. This isn't a video about censorship or speaking on college campuses, so I'm not going to go over all the various nuances inherent to that question. But, from research, it seems very clear that higher dispositional empathy leads to more, not less, polarization. Why does this happen? The best explanation is what Breithaupt calls the three-person model of empathy. We empathize with one side. One side hates the other side. If we're more empathetic, meaning we share the emotions of one side more, we hate the other side more. And so, more empathy produces more hatred. Paul Bloom did a series of studies where he told people stories about various horrors being perpetrated around the world. Then, he asked participants what they wanted to do to the perpetrators. People who were higher in dispositional empathy wanted to punish the perpetrators more. This is why empathy can be bad for politics. You have empathy for the people on your side, and out of a desire to defend them, you lash out more on the other side. Since empathy spotlights, this can lead to some seriously misguided thought patterns. For example, you could empathize with a rich author who's been harassed online over the group that she spread misinformation about with her writing. Or you could empathize with a conspiracy theorist's anti-establishment outrage at being removed from YouTube over the parents of the dead children that his fans are harassing. Or you could end up empathizing with the candidate that best channels your empathy over the one with the policies you support more. We can have arguments about all these specific scenarios. Some of these thought patterns are worse than others, but they all leave crucial information out of the picture. And so, I'd like to zoom in on one specific case of empathy's biases.
People think this guy's an intellectual.
Here we have
Ben Shapiro.
the stalwart defenders of empathy.
By the way, speaking of atheism, you believe in a sky god that has all the answers for you. Facts over feelings.
The arguments against Shapiro don't actually engage with the flaws of empathy. Instead, this clip appeals to left-wing Twitter and YouTube because it confirms their ideas about conservatism.
Good Republican and conservative policy hurts everyone around them. And that's literally the thing he's saying. I mean, it's literally just what we've been saying Republicans and conservatives have been doing for forever.
I'll reiterate. Conservatism isn't unempathetic. It just spotlights empathy differently. Pro-life instead of pro-choice. Blue lives matter or all lives matter, not Black lives matter. I'm not defending any of these ideas, but I'd like you to see the empathy inherent in all of them. By not understanding how empathy functions on both sides, these left-wing YouTubers just end up proving empathy's bias. After all, they have very similar jobs to Shapiro. They should have at least some cognitive empathy for how he sometimes phrases things poorly. Instead, we get...
People are okay, because what he's saying is nonsense. What he's saying is nonsense.
Remember, empathy is bias toward the in-group, and for someone who argues left-wing politics professionally, Ben Shapiro is the ultimate out-group member.
I went to the thesaurus, and I looked at antonyms of empathy.
You could have sympathy. Aw, it sure is a shame that you don't have a living wage. But it doesn't affect me, dog.
If you lack empathy, and I think if you aggressively attempt to strip yourself of empathy or the world of empathy, you are what is known as a sociopath.
Ben Shapiro would like more hard-heartedness in politics, more mercilessness, more pitilessness, more ruthlessness.
He hasn't had sex. Actually, he did brag about being a virgin till marriage, so that tracks.
He wants more retribution, revenge, vengeance, venom, vindictiveness.
Like, Jesus Christ, quit being such a fucking pussy, okay?
Vitriol, atrocity, barbarity, brutality, cruelty, sadism, savageness, savagery.
So when you understand where his politics comes from, you understand why he's a rotten person.
He's saying, oh, you can only empathize with people in your in-group. No, plenty of people empathize with people who are not in their in-group.
Remember, the argument, or at least the good version of it, is that empathy is biased toward the in-group, not that you can't have empathy for people on the other side. We're talking tendencies and probabilities, not can or can't. As a side note, I'm sure Kalinske would recognize the difference between these two things if talking about systemic racism. But empathy's bias gets in the way.
So what he's saying is, funny enough, he wants to only live in the world of theory, which is, by definition, anti-empirical.
I'm taking your advice, Ben. I'm taking your advice right now. I feel zero empathy for you whatsoever.
Look past the layers of irony in this statement and take it at face value. By arguing against Shapiro with such vitriol, they essentially prove the idea that empathy is biased toward an in-group, and that it can lead to cruelty and vitriol. These commentators aren't being unempathetic. They're deploying empathy naturally. I'm sure plenty of these people have high dispositional empathy, but they're not using situational empathy for Ben Shapiro because of empathy's biases. In other, not particularly well-phrased words,
So the reason that empathy is bad for politics is because it leads you to empathize with people that you are more likely to like, as opposed to people you don't like.
don't think that I'm letting Ben Shapiro off the hook. There's actually an older clip of Ben Shapiro arguing against empathy that's even dumber.
Mm-hmm. For you, as a white male, have you ever tried putting yourself in these people's shoes?
Shapiro goes on a slightly off-topic rant here. Then he mentions the idea that empathy is bad for politics.
There's actually a fascinating study about this. It says empathy is bad politics.
Then the questioner clarifies.
Have you ever looked at the world through their eyes? Do you know what it's like to be gay or black or to be discriminated?
He's asking for Shapiro to exercise cognitive empathy for minority groups who are discriminated against. And here, Shapiro just gives a standard response.
While you're empathizing for the person whose shoes you're standing in, you're forgetting about the effects of the public policy you're recommending on the other million people the public policy actually impacts.
But it isn't a question about whether empathy is biased. It's a question about whether Shapiro has ever tried to exercise it for people who are discriminated against, people he presumably disagrees with. He clearly hasn't, but he doesn't offer a good reason for doing so. Ben Shapiro is basically saying, because empathy is biased, I will lean into that bias and not consider the positions of anyone who disagrees with me. But wouldn't it make more sense to say that empathy for the other side is even more important because of empathy's biases? Just because empathy is flawed doesn't mean that it shouldn't be exercised. We're not going to get rid of empathy anytime soon, and I wouldn't really want to live in a world without it. So being against empathy in the political domain seems to me just a little absurd. Instead, I think we should use empathy wisely. I have a few rough guidelines on that front. 1. Don't use empathy itself as a guide. Instead, let a sense of the broader statistical picture guide your empathy. So before saying anything about Rocky Jones's death, understand the net impacts of various immigration policies. Then find actual people who embody those impacts. Have empathy for them. 2. In political thinking, cognitive empathy is a little better than affective empathy. The study of political polarization and empathy found that cognitive empathy isn't correlated with increased polarization in the same way as affective empathy. Cognitive empathy is still biased, but it's less biased. 3. When using empathy, we need to act against empathy's biases. Purposefully spotlight as many different people as possible. Purposefully use more situational empathy for people different from us. People we don't know, people we don't like, people of different races from us, and yes, different political affiliations. I don't think any intelligent political discourse is possible without exercising some degree of cognitive empathy for your opponents. Ultimately, empathy isn't bad for politics. It just could be better. Thanks for watching this video. I put a whole lot of effort into making it, so I'd really appreciate if you liked, you commented, and subscribed. If you have any disagreements with me on anything, let me know in the comments. I would love to fight it out.